Good morning and welcome. I'm Elizabeth Krause. I'm a tax partner in the Seattle office of K&L Gates. I also co-lead our power practice and sustainable economy initiative. We help our clients in a variety of industries to achieve their sustainability goals, including, for example, in renewable energy and fuels development and investment, corporate energy sourcing, carbon capture, removal and sequestration, ethical supply chain, sustainable agriculture, and a variety of related financial instruments. I'm very glad to welcome today to our distinguished speaker series on the sustainable economy, Dawn Weisz. Dawn is a trailblazer in the community choice field. She was the founder of Marin Clean Energy, the first community choice aggregator in California, and the first to achieve an investment grade credit rating. She is also founder of the California Community Choice Association, which represents the interests of California's community choice electricity providers in the California legislature and at state regulatory agencies. Dawn serves as the CEO of MCE, where she's responsible for the vision, strategy, and leadership of the CCA, which now serves more than 480,000 customers across Contra Costa, Marin, Napa, and Solano counties. Welcome, Dawn. Just a quick note before we get started, Dawn has very graciously agreed to take live questions, so please go ahead and submit any questions you have in the chat window. We did get a couple during the RSVP process. Thank you for submitting those, and we'll integrate them into the discussion. Well, to kick us off, Dawn, could you please give us a brief introduction to MCE and its role in the California energy system?
Yeah, I'm happy to, and thank you so much for having me, Elizabeth. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'll just start off with a quick overview of what CCA is. So CCA stands for Community Choice Aggregation, and I sometimes refer to it as community choice because that's a little bit more of a friendly term, or we might use the acronym CCA, but basically, it allows local governments to become the power purchaser for their communities. And this includes all customer types: residential, commercial, municipal, industrial, agricultural. And what makes it unique is that it is governed by a local board of elected officials. So MCE, for example, we serve 36 communities. Cities, towns, and counties, and we have one elected official from each of those jurisdictions on our board, and that board makes decisions on rates, programs, power procurement, that sort of thing. The goal of most community choice programs is to create more local control over electricity decisions, often to achieve greenhouse gas emissions reductions, sometimes to increase renewable energy, but also to control costs, allow for more transparency and accountability in the decision making, and lastly, to reinvest energy dollars into the local economy. And the last thing I'll say is just a little comment about MCE. So MCE, Marin Clean Energy, we're the first community choice program in California. We formed in 2008, and we began serving customers in May of 2010. So we're about to hit our 11-year anniversary. Our goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, grow our green economy, and address social and environmental justice issues created by fossil fuels. So since our launch, a lot of other CCAs have formed across the state. And I've got a few slides that I'd love to get up on the screen here, because I wanted to say a little bit about what's going on across the state. There's been so much activity since we launched that it's a big change. So let's take a look at these slides here. This is just intended to give you a sense of how pervasive community choice has now become in the California energy market. So before MCE launched 11 years ago, there were 3 large investor-owned utilities. They're sometimes referred to as IOUs. Serving about 75% of California's energy customers. And the remaining 25% were served by municipal utilities, which are locally governed by cities or towns in different parts of the state. So mostly IOUs were serving customers. And what you can see here is that in 2018, the IOUs were still serving a pretty wide share of customers. Since we launched in 2010, it took a couple of years for the next CCA to launch in 2013, and then another one in 2014. And then it started to really pick up steam, and we saw quite a few launch in 2019 and 2020. And as you can see in this year, it's about 50-50. So the IOUs are getting down to about 50%. And in 2023, they're projected to be serving a little less than 50% of the load. while CCAs are going to be serving about a third or a little more than a third. I'll also make a comment here that you'll see direct access is showing here, and that's a structure where a for-profit company, a private corporation can serve customers, but there's a cap on direct access in California, so that's why we're not seeing a lot of growth there. We can move on to the next slide. This just gives you a quick breakdown of how many California communities are now served by CCA, over 200. And this is growing. Every month we have to update the slide because there's a lot of activity right now. A lot of counties are served by CCA, over 30% of the counties in California. And the number of cities and towns with a CCA is almost 40%. So it's a lot of, it's 11 million customers, almost 30% of all the people in California are served by a CCA. So it's been a huge change since our launch. You can go to the next slide. And then this, I just wanted to give you a sense of how this impacts the new build of energy resources. A lot of CCAs formed for renewable energy development. And as a result, we're seeing a lot of new build renewable resources. So over 6,000 megawatts total. Again, we have to update this every month because there's always new ones. But this is a big share of California's renewable resources are now being contributed by CCAs. And there's a pretty wide diversity of technologies there, as you can see in the bar chart. A lot of different resources, and what's becoming more common nowadays is more storage. So you can go to the next slide. And you don't have to read this really small, fine print, but I think you all can have access to these slides after if you want to get into the weeds. But this just gives you a sense on the map of where the new power is being built. So there's a lot in the Central Valley, but there's also quite a bit sprinkled around throughout where the CCAs are. A lot of new resources, and this really equates to a lot of new jobs, and that's one of the things I'll talk about later. And next slide. That might be it, which is great. Yeah, thank you. And so I think that the main takeaway here is just that there's a lot of community choice activity. And the last thing I'll mention while we're talking big picture is just that I touched on municipal utilities, which are local government agencies that have been supplying power to customers really for a long time historically in California. But what's different there is that they handle the poles and wires and the generation. And so municipal utilities like LA Department of Water and Power is a pretty well-known one. They've been around for a very long time. They handle the generation side of the business as well as the distribution side. CCAs are a little different. We just handle the generation side of the business, and the IOU, in our case PG&E, handles the delivery of that electricity.
Thanks so much, Dawn. I think that macro context is just super helpful for figuring out where CCAs fit. But in your introduction, you talked about local choice, and that's one of the biggest key aspects of a CCA model. So how does this filter down to the consumer? What does this look like to households?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, it really allows all types of customers to have a closer relationship with their energy provider. As I mentioned, our governing board is made up of elected officials. We're subject to the Brown Act, which means that all of our meetings are held in public. We have to notice the meetings, send out notices of when they're going to be in advance and what's going to be on the agenda. Anyone in the community can come to our meetings. Nowadays, we're doing them via Zoom. Still, folks can come and participate that way. And it creates a lot of connection to the decision-making process, a lot of transparency. And the other thing, customers still get their energy bill from the investor-owned utility, the IOU, but all the charges for generation are shown as MCE charges. And all the charges for transmission and distribution and gas show up as the IOU charges. So customers still get they get information from us about our programs, like we have a lot of energy efficiency programs, rebates for electric vehicle chargers or low-income EV electric vehicle purchases. Um, Customers get that information from us. And then another way where it impacts our local community is that local developers and landowners can sell power to us via a feed-in tariff. So we have a tariff that allows anyone in the community who has a renewable power supply that meets our criteria, they can automatically sell it to us through this tariff under a 20-year fixed rate contract. And that has helped a lot of local landowners to actually get projects built and get financed because they know they have a place they can sell that energy for a 20-year term. So there are a lot of different ways that the community can get engaged in a CCA.
So that's all great. And I guess one of the things that comes up a lot in conversations right now, particularly in renewable energy, but also in the utility space, is energy justice and environmental justice. And a lot of the programs that you mentioned are great for homeowners, right? Energy efficiency people who have control over their windows and their heating and so forth. But what about those members of the community who are renters or who don't have access to solar, for example, traditionally? How is MCE thinking about those aspects of its consumer base?
Yeah, well, we think that that part of the consumer base is absolutely important. And as a local government agency, we're really responsible to understand and address the needs in our community wherever we can, wherever there's an energy nexus. Just this year, our board passed the MCE Cares program, which has allocated $10 million to a program that helps with rate relief for our most vulnerable customers who are having trouble paying their bills. It also provides rate relief to our small business customers who've had trouble with bill payments during COVID. We also, even before we were dealing with the pandemic in our communities, we've been dealing with fires, and we've launched programs to help fire victims. Our first one was in 2017 called the Napa Rebuild Program, which helped fire victims rebuild their homes with incentives from us to allow them to not have to install gas infrastructure in their homes. And this has allowed customers to save money on that and be able to have an all-electric home that's a bit safer and helps them with the cost of rebuilding. We also launched a Yeti battery giveaway program last summer for our medically vulnerable customers. And that's because we've had a lot of IOU planned outages where there are wildfire conditions, and so our investor-owned utility shuts down the power grid for periods of time. And that can be really, really concerning, a really big issue for folks that rely on power for medical needs. So we gave away over 100 Yeti batteries to homes that were in that situation. And then we've also launched an energy storage program that's targeting nonprofits and community-based organizations and shelters for battery storage for PSPS events. And we're hoping that that will allow folks to kind of make it through those difficult periods and other emergencies as well.
I mean, I think some of the factors that you mentioned probably won't be relieved this year or any year in the future, right? Fires seem to be in California's DNA these days.
Mm-hmm.
So do you anticipate continuing programs like this? I mean, is there a limit to how a government organization or an organization like a CCA that has one foot in government and one foot in business? Is there a limit on what they can do or what they should be doing?
Yeah, I don't think that there is a limit. I think that as we grow, we're going to be able to do, even more programs and really deepen our impact in the community. One of the things that we think a lot about is how we can create more diversity, equity, and inclusion through our activities. And we do a lot in our hiring practices to encourage a more diverse team. It helps us think better and plan better and strategize better when we have a team that's diverse. We intentionally have diverse hiring panels, and then we want to retain diverse staff as well. So we have a DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion Tiger team in our organization that works on a wide range of activities with each of our departments to make sure that we're aware of and talking about the wide variety of cultures within our community and supporting needs that might come up on a routine basis. We also bring this philosophy to our vendors, ranging from energy providers to printers and food service vendors, using a questionnaire. So we ask folks about their diversity practices, their hiring practices, their labor standards. We want to make sure that folks are getting paid a fair wage. And so those are some ways that we try to broaden our impact beyond just the primary mission.
So I guess one of the things about your business as a CCA, right, is you touch a lot of different aspects of the community. You said earlier that you're responsible for the generation, right, and obviously responsible for the consumer-facing activities. We talked a little bit about DEI and energy justice, but when it comes down to buying the power, how are you incorporating any of those concepts into that process? I mean, they're just electrons, right? Do we need to worry about environmental justice in that context? Do we need to worry about energy justice in that context?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, historically, the impacts of the fossil fuel industry have disproportionately impacted low-income communities and communities of color. So MCE makes decisions really through the lens of environmental justice to make sure that we're providing net positive value in those communities in particular. And this shows up in the way that we get projects built in our community. One example is the MCE Solar One project, which was built in Richmond, California. It was actually the biggest public-private partnership in the Bay Area and resulted in a 60-acre, 10 megawatt, 10.5 megawatt solar facility, pretty big. And it created over 350 jobs. Well, we had a 50% local hire requirement. The city of Richmond is a city with very high unemployment, a lot of need for jobs, and we really wanted to create an opportunity for green collar jobs in that community. So before we even broke ground on the project, we spent 2 years funding some training programs that we partnered with a community-based organization called Richmond Build that trained folks on the same solar equipment that they were going to be installing, so that when it came time to build the project, we actually had folks that had been trained or were qualified and ready to take on those jobs. And some of those folks were hired by the developers that were installing the project to then go and work on other projects around the state and even in other states. So we try to find ways to add value through our projects and create jobs and just create positivity in the community. I loved that, as this project was getting built, there were folks that were walking or riding their bike to work every day because, some of them didn't have a car, but they were able to get to their job because it was right in their backyard. And now they get to drive by that every day and know that, or, pass by it all the time and know that they contributed to getting it built. And that's the kind of thing that we want to create in our community. I'll also add that in addition to building projects, our focus on environmental justice also shows up in our choice about programs. So our energy efficiency programs primarily target multifamily buildings. We also have a program called the Low-Income Families and Tenants program that gets into households that are often hidden communities that don't get touched by traditional energy efficiency programs, by using trusted advocates from within the community who can knock on doors and get into those homes and help provide energy efficiency upgrades to lower energy bills for customers. And the last but not least, we even use an environmental justice lens when we decide what events we're going to sponsor. So we made a decision last year that every event that we're going to sponsor, and we spend a fair share of dollars sponsoring events to get our brand out there, we are now only sponsoring events in DEI communities to make sure that those dollars are going to places where there's a greater need.
Okay. That's really interesting. I think one of the things that comes up in this context around environmental justice and energy justice, sort of putting on my project finance and tax hat, does this make the projects just dramatically more expensive, or is this something that can be implemented by other organizations that don't maybe don't have quite the consumer base that you all do.
Yeah, not at all. It's absolutely doable. I think all of the things that I've mentioned are not things that add significantly to the costs. It takes more time. It's not as convenient. I will say when we were trying to meet that 50% local hire requirement um, for the NCE Solar One project, we had to think outside the box.
Mhm.
Typically agencies like ours issue an RFP, a request for proposal, and it goes out to big agencies that are used to receiving RFPs, and then they have people that are used to responding. Well, we needed to use a different tool to get to the folks in the community that sort of thing wasn't on their radar. We went. We looked for local businesses that poured concrete. We looked for local businesses that could put up fencing, and we called local. We kind of went through the phone book and found businesses that would be a good fit for the types of work that would be needed. And we called them up and said, hey, do you have any guys that can pour concrete? Hey, do you have any guys that can help put up a security fence around this perimeter? Hey, do you have some folks that can help with the check-in station? And we did, we assigned staff to do jobs that aren't traditional, but it wasn't that much more time consuming. And we found great local companies that were able to do the work very cost effectively. And it just had a much bigger impact because we slightly adjusted our methods. And that was really the only change that was needed.
It sounds like creativity is a big part of your organization.
Yes.
And obviously a big part of why CCAs exist in the first place. Let's pivot a little bit to another keystone of the CCA model. You mentioned earlier that one of the big things for MCE is to be able to go after renewable electricity, green electrons. This is a really exciting time for you at MCE, not only because renewable energy has come a long way in the several years since you all started, but also because MCE is one of the founding members of a newly formed Joint Powers Authority, the California Community Power. Can you give some background about that organization, how it came to be?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a joint powers authority, which means it's a group of local government agencies banding together to do something in common. And we've, since the I think all of the CCAs that have formed in the last 10 years, we have a lot of camaraderie. We partner together to we share marketing material, we share strategies on how to get the data that we need from the utilities. How do we collaborate on bills and legislation and things like that. And it was kind of a no-brainer that it would make sense for us to power on some joint procurement efforts. We all do our procurement individually for the most part, but banding together through a JPA gave us the opportunity to think about doing some much bigger projects potentially, and also potentially taking on some projects that might involve newer technologies where there can be a little more risk, and spreading that risk across different CCAs can be helpful and allow a bigger project to get built. So CC Power is giving us the opportunity to collaborate with these other CCAs on newer technologies, and we issued an RFP to buy power back in the fall and got over 100 responses. So we're still in the process of scaling that down to a short list and determining which projects we want to move forward with. But it's these CCAs that have participated so far represent a lot of demand, a lot of load. So we definitely have the appetite for some big projects, and I'm excited to see what we can do together through this JPA.
Awesome. Well, so the concept of a joint powers authority, it says to the lawyer part of my brain that this must be yet another sort of government function that's coming together. So you've got the government at the CCA level, and then is there also sort of a government overlay at the JPA level?
Yeah, so the board of CC Power is made up of the CEOs of each CCA. Wow, that was a lot of acronyms. Um, so it's a little bit different than our board, for example, which is made up of elected officials. So we, the CEOs, are not elected officials. We are paid staff, but we are subject to the Brown Act. So all of our meetings are held in public session. We are a local government agency, and so we need to adhere to those rules of accountability. But yeah, we are all local government agencies, and in this case, the board is made up of folks that are leading their own CCAs from a staff level. And
Okay, I see.
pretty common. There are a lot of JPAs across California that deal with ranging from potholes to transit, made up of staff. Often public works staff will head up those JPAs. So this is similar in some ways to that.
Okay, sort of the middle of the Venn diagram. So given the government overlay, are you restricted as a CCA or even as the JPA, CCAs working together, are you restricted where you source generation? Must it be in California? Are you permitted to source, I don't know, maybe over the border in Nevada, maybe that's close enough to serve your purposes?
Yeah, we don't have a restriction as a JPA regarding where we purchase our power. I think that we do have a strong preference for in-state resources. Those tend to be, there are a number of reasons why, the local jobs is important, the longer you transmit energy, the more losses you incur on line losses can be an issue. And you can also get what's called congestion on the grid if you have power going in a direction where a lot of other folks are going. But if you have generation that's close to the need, you don't have to worry about congestion quite as much. So there are a number of reasons why we are likely to look for projects that are close by, but we don't have any restrictions per se.
Okay, thank you. Well, okay, so going back to the JPA really quickly, the California Community Power. So if these are all sort of local government organizations, clearly it's helpful to band together for pricing and for procurement and so forth, as you said. But you also said that you all already interact quite a bit. So why, other than the pricing aspect, was there another big reason for banding together as the Joint Powers Authority?
Well, to specifically procure jointly, and it helps. From a lender perspective, I think it's helpful to have a number of large organizations with strong balance sheets behind a project, especially when you're going to do a big project. And I think the other thing that is that we are all seeing as an issue is that the state is really looking to move away from fossil power generation, and that includes natural gas generation. And the fossil-based, natural gas-based resources have been an instrument that has provided what's called reliability for the state for many years. And they tend to run, day and night, 24/7. As we're transitioning to more solar resources across the state, there's an issue when the sun goes down. So you need a lot of power to pick up that load in the evening. And so now, the load shape in California is a little misaligned with the generation shape. And we're needing to kind of bring that back into balance. And there are potentially there are some large projects that we'd be able to purchase from jointly that would allow us to fill in those gaps. This is also an issue that we're all dealing with on our own through our own procurement, and we will continue to. But I wanted to mention that's kind of an overarching issue that I think we're all aware of, and that is part of the driver in creating this organization.
Okay. So is it fair to say that the other CCAs that are aligned with MC about renewable energy and value of renewables to the state?
Yes, absolutely. The state has set some good, strong standards around how much renewable energy we must provide as a load serving entity. But all of the participating CCAs in CC Power have higher standards that have been set by their own local boards. So we meet the state standard, but then we exceed it. And we'll be doing that through CC Power as well, I'm sure.
So, going back to the slides earlier, you're projecting that as of 2023, the CCAs together will serve a little more than a third of the state, which is really impressive. Um, but even if all the CCAs in California band together, and even if they all have these higher standards, is it realistic to think that the entire state could really be powered using only renewable resources in the near term?
Yes, absolutely. I think that the key is shaping that energy to deliver in the times of day that we need it, and also to some degree shaping the customer usage patterns a bit too. So ultimately, it means more storage. The solar energy that's generated during the day, sometimes there's so much going onto the grid that it has to be curtailed if there's not enough demand coming from customers. So getting that extra solar into a battery and being able to draw that energy out and use it in the evening is really the key to transitioning to a 100% renewable future. And we're definitely already moving in that direction. So there's no question that we can get there. It's just going to take a bit of time and some innovative technology and some incorporation of many different types of storage to get there.
So, so we've talked about batteries in a couple, or storage really, in a couple of different contexts now. You mentioned the Yeti battery giveaway earlier. And I believe you mentioned in that context that that was primarily intended to help folks who were going to experience grid outages during fires and so forth. We've mentioned sort of the tension about, when the sun goes down or when there's too much solar being produced or what have you. Are we always talking about short-term storage? What about the long-term storage? Obviously when California Community Power was announced, there was a 500 megawatt long duration storage plant announced with that. What's the answer here? Is it all short? Is it
Yeah.
all long? Is it a mix?
It's a mix. We need both. We need a lot of both. And what we need the short-term storage for is uh, the daily need of sucking up that extra solar in the day, putting it on the grid in the evening. 4 hours is great for that because you can really get at that evening period. It's a little bit longer of a need in the evening during the winter months where you don't have quite as long of a solar day. Um, but that short-term battery is really important for kind of the daily need. The long-term batteries are also really crucial though, and that's because you can have multiple cloudy days where the short-term batteries aren't getting charged up enough. You also can have emergency outages where there's not a way to keep those batteries charging in the way that we want, and we might need 8 hours or 12 hours of storage to get through those periods of time, whether it's the cloudy day scenario, particularly in the winter months where you don't have as much solar to charge those batteries. The long duration storage will help during that time period and then help during these grid outages that we experience when there are wildfire conditions.
Mm-hmm. Thinking back to the slides that you presented earlier, one thing that I thought was interesting was that of the resources that you all are looking at, there's a lot of hybridized assets. And there also is an increasing amount of standalone storage. But what I find curious, and maybe this is just because I'm from one of these northern states, is that California already leads the country in energy storage. There are already so many batteries in California relative to most every other state in the country. How much more do you need? I mean, are we going to the point where all of the projects will be hybridized, or you all just won't get involved with them? Um, what what's the direction here?
Oh, we're getting involved in that, and we need to. And the reason why there are so many batteries in California and why there's going to continue to be even more is because we have so much solar in California and
Mhm.
wind to some degree. I think, wind is a nice resource that complements solar because it tends to peak in the morning and the evening, so it helps even out that solar huge peak. But we have so much solar on the grid. There was even a day last month when 95% of energy on the grid was renewable in California.
Oh, wow,
Now that was
that's
a
super.
very quick point in time, and as soon as we had the clouds show up or it becomes later in the day, we really need other resources to pick up the slack and fill in the gaps. But we don't have as much storage as we need right now. And we can see that in the load shapes that we look, or the generation shapes that we look at, but we can also see it in the pricing. Buying evening power, strips of evening power, is very expensive. Getting midday strips of power is very inexpensive, and that's just the consequence of the type of resources that we have on the grid right now. So that's going to continue to be a trend, I think, for quite some time. And we're definitely, we want to be part of that solution. And, you know, you mentioned standalone, you know, there's a need for battery storage that can, you know, suck up power on the grid, stick it on the grid in the evening. But also the hybridized resources that you mentioned are, in some cases, going into existing solar facilities and adding batteries right there behind the meter in some cases, so that it's, you know, the charging and the discharging is happening right at that location.
So, okay, storage, it's very exciting. It's very crucial, right? We definitely need it in order to sort of shift that cheap power midday to the higher price points later in the day. But batteries are also kind of a hard topic. One, there's the question about, you know, are batteries really what we need? Are they ever going to improve to the point where they're going to be sufficient for the grid needs, right? Then there's also the question of, well, batteries, particularly lithium ion, are really challenging from a sustainability angle. I mean, for a lot of reasons. There's raw materials, there's labor and environmental concerns, recycling is interesting to say the least. But there also is a growing category of alternatives to lithium ion. And one thing that I found kind of interesting over the last year or two is what appears to be picking up demand again in, for example, pumped hydro. I don't know how practical that is in the state of California, but it's interesting to see more interest in the north. So I guess here's the question. How is MCE thinking about the future of storage? Is it all going to be lithium ion? Are we just going to have to go with whatever the market says we can have? Or is MCE going to be able to take a more proactive approach?
Well, you know, we have some concerns about the environmental impacts of batteries. You know, obviously they are, there are some, you know, resources that need to be mined to go into them. You know, at the end of their useful life, there are hazardous waste issues. We're concerned about that, and so we're really looking at how we can address health and labor impacts up front with our potential battery vendors. Some vendors have a plan built in to take the battery back after its useful life and you know, recycle it or, you know, deal with it in a safe way. That's an important element for us. But in addition, we're really looking to go beyond batteries as a form of storage and find a diversity of solutions. I think diversity is the key in every area of our business. I mean, you know, we don't just pick one technology and put all our eggs in that basket. We look for a lot of different solutions and kind of spread our choices across a wide range. And so to go beyond batteries, you know, there are other forms of storage. There's one of the technologies we're really interested in is renewable hydrogen. That's a technology that doesn't have any negative impacts, you know, when it's being created or when it's being used for generation back into the grid. You know, air and water are the byproducts, and that we can handle. So that's a really interesting technology. There's also a lot of other interesting newer technologies like compressed air, gravity storage, pumped hydro is another one where you're simply moving bodies of water from one place to another, and allowing gravity to kind of push as the water goes downhill, it creates energy. Same with, you know, gravity storage. So there's a lot of interesting technologies out there. Another technology is, you know, offshore wind. There's been some real interest in getting more of that going off the coast in California. As I mentioned, that really complements the solar generation shape and provides some good evening power right when we need it. So those are all resources that we're really interested in incorporating into the mix to help with the challenges of the current shape.
Mhm. And I apologize if this gets a little bit too much at state regulatory aspects, but with your MCE hat on and sort of thinking about green power and environmental impacts and so forth, and environmental justice and energy justice, do we still need natural gas? I mean, particularly if it could be paired with carbon capture or something along those lines. You mentioned offshore wind as a complementary power resource, which implies anyway that solar, even solar plus storage, is not necessarily the complete solution. Is there still a role for natural gas?
I don't think that eventually, I don't think there will be a need for natural gas. I think right now, the state doesn't have enough other resources to rely upon for sometimes in the day. So I think we're in a transition now where we are still needing that resource absolutely right now to make sure that the grid is reliable and that we have some backup resources when needed. But ultimately, it will not be necessary to have natural gas on the grid at all. I think we can have a completely fossil-free grid, and we just need to incorporate and layer in the clean technologies as we can, as they become affordable. We also want to make sure we're not impacting customers with much higher prices. So we want to, solar pricing has come down dramatically. It's super affordable right now. It's actually cheaper than natural gas in many cases. And so we want to see that happen with some of these other newer technologies. When we launched MCE, solar was really an expensive technology, and folks thought we were crazy to be talking about getting so much solar into our mix. But now it's the cheapest resource out there for the most part. But there are other resources, you mentioned wind, solar, batteries. There's also biogas and biomass, and that's another element. I don't think that's going to be like the lion's share of our energy supply across the state, but it's an important piece. And one reason it's important is because we have a lot of wood waste material that contributes to fire fuels, and we need safe ways of disposing of it. And can often create energy at the same time when we're disposing of that waste. We have a couple of landfill waste to energy projects in our portfolio, and we really would love to help communities get to a zero energy future where there's not any waste, and hopefully we'll get there. But in the meantime, that's another resource that we might as well be using as power supply rather than just flaring it into the air and adding to our carbon emissions.
Yeah. So that's a great transition, actually. I think you mentioned earlier very briefly, you have some electrification programs for some of the folks who went through fires. And then you also just introduced the concept of RNG and landfill waste to energy. One area, the grid, we can totally get the grid to renewable power. I mean, I think that you seem pretty clear and confident about that. And so that covers off Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. But what about other major polluting areas? MC is a power company, and I get it. There's only so much you can do. But for example, some other power companies, just to use the very general term, across the country are really actively looking at electrification of vehicles, not only as a new market for power, but also as a way to impact Scope 3 emissions, for example, in order to impact air quality in their communities that they serve. So for example, some of the people in the audience, and you may also have seen this, Portland General Electric up north from you recently announced this big electric truck charging station. They're running it with Daimler, which has some manufacturing up here for electric trucks. It made a big splash in this part of the woods. How is MCE thinking about electrification? How are you thinking about your role in the community when it comes to Scope 3 emissions?
Yeah, great question. We're actually doing a lot to help electrify transportation. It's really a natural part of our goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We're also doing a lot through our energy efficiency programs to help with what we call fuel switching, help folks switch from gas to electric appliances. It's safer and healthier. Sometimes indoor air quality can be impacted by gas appliances, especially when you tighten up the envelope of a building. Those fumes can become more of an issue than they were before when you had leaks. So fuel switching is part of our work. But as far as transportation, we have an electric vehicle program where we provide rebates for commercial and multifamily charging stations. We have 1,000 so far that have been part of the program. So we've gotten a lot of charging stations built. We're excited about that. We really focus our charging station dollars in places where people can charge during the day. So we haven't focused so much in the residential sector, except for multifamily, where we think there's a real need. But all the other dollars are going towards daytime commercial venue businesses, where folks can charge during the day when we have all that solar energy on the grid. We have programs to try and help encourage folks at home to not plug in if they're going to work now, or if they start going to work at post-COVID. We don't want folks to come home at 6 o'clock and plug in their vehicle, because that's when the sun's getting ready to go down, and we end up having to fill that need with natural gas facilities, as I talked about. So getting more electric vehicles is really an important part of the solution, especially if we can get them to charge in the middle of the day. We also offer funds for income qualified customers to purchase a new or used electric vehicle. We host EV education and test drive events. And we've also installed an EV charging station powered by solar at our office location in Santa Fe. And we've made it free to the public to charge there during the pandemic, because we don't have staff coming into the office. And we've actually seen a lot of usage, people coming and charging up for free in the daytime, which is what we like. We also chose our second office location, which is in Concord, California, because they have EV charging available there for our staff and our board and visitors, members of the public. It was, and kind of getting back into your scope 3 comment, we also chose that office location because it was on the BART line, which is a great public transit system in part of our service area. So making sure folks have access to good public transit is an important part of adjusting scope 3. And then one other thing I'll say on scope 3 emissions is just that we've always offered remote participation options. And when we hold our regular board meetings, even before the pandemic hit, we would allow folks to dial in remotely. We would have the meeting both in Concord and Santa Fe, so our board could go to the closer location and reduce the carbon impacts of driving to those locations. And we provide education about reducing your carbon footprint, at home during the holidays, et cetera, through interface with our customers. We send out, email messages and blogs to help folks with some of the scope 3 emissions. And we also try and buy locally from local companies, both to support the local economy, but also to reduce the carbon footprint. And we especially like buying from companies that have sustainability practices. We do survey our companies to see what their practices are, and we keep that in mind when we're making our procurement decisions.
Yeah, I think it's becoming increasingly important. We've had, everyone loves lawyers, right? But for the last 10 years, our Australia offices have had a sustainability initiative and practice and annual audit and so forth. And now we're starting to roll that out firm-wide. So it's definitely something that we've already been implementing in a lot of ways, but we're becoming even more aware of it through our clients' practices, and then also, frankly, through people in the firm agitating for it. Really quickly, we've got about 10 more minutes, so if anyone in the audience has questions, please do put them into the chat function. But one of the questions that we got in preparation for this program was about electrification, specifically vehicle electrification. But what that question was about was almost the converse of what you just mentioned. Clearly, you want people to charge during the day because you don't want the additional stress on load in the evening. That's fine. But what about the other side of that? Can vehicle electrification materially impact storage, right? Can it act as sort of a material storage asset on the grid? Are we ever going to get to that point?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's on the horizon, and you know what we're talking about here is vehicle to grid connection. So using your vehicle to power the grid or power your home. There are some creative folks in our community that use their EV to charge their refrigerator and other household appliances during recent wildfire events. Um, I think right now the problem is that that voids your warranty on your EV. So it seems to work fine, but it's not, the technology isn't at a place yet, I think, where car manufacturers are behind it. And I think also there are concerns from the distribution utility, the investor-owned utility, um, regarding how to manage that, because homes are kind of designed, the grid is kind of designed for energy to flow in one direction. And if you install a solar panel on your home, the utility comes out to make sure it's all connected correctly and to make sure that the power can flow in the other direction. But if EVs are doing that without oversight, it could potentially create problems on the local distribution system. If you had a lot of EVs in one location, for example, that could create some unintended consequences. So I think there are definitely some mechanics that need to get worked out. But I think it is it is in our future, and I think that is going to be part of the solution going forward. And the great thing about using an EV as an energy source is that it's portable. So you can take it to the community shelter or the fire station or the place that really needs power at that time. And use it as a real cushion. So we're excited to see that happening. And and on that note, I'll mention that one of the bids I've seen recently for a power supply project uses old EV batteries in a stationary location as a battery to help power the grid. So even if those EVs aren't yet allowed to plug into the grid, the batteries from the vehicles, once they're done with the vehicle is done with its useful life, those batteries might be able to have a second life as a storage provider.
That's interesting that you mentioned that. I've heard about some of these projects, but I guess one question that always arises for me is, well, okay, so if they've been used in a vehicle, how much useful life do they really have?
Yes,
And how
fair
worthwhile
question.
is the investment going to be? Is
Oh,
that something
that's
that you all have thought about?
Oh yeah, that's probably the first thing we thought about. um, yeah, but that is, that's why we need more experience, trying out these new technologies. That batteries haven't been around quite long enough for us to see what happens with that second useful life, and so I'm sure that will be factored into the pricing. And if it's a successful type of project, then we may see more of those, and I'm sure that the pricing will reflect the success of that type of technology.
I think you've earned a fan in the audience because one of the questions that we've got popped up, which was what legislation would other states need to establish or encourage CCAs? And I want to build on that just slightly to say, okay, once you've got the CCA, then how do you get a community to adopt the CCA model? How do you obtain customers?
Yeah, that's. I'm glad you asked that question because I haven't said anything about other states, and I want to point out that California was not the first state to adopt community choice enabling legislation. We learned from a few others. Massachusetts is a state that adopted community choice legislation back in the late 90s. Ohio is another. I actually went out to visit the Cape Light Compact back in 2007 before we launched MCE and learned so much from them. There are many states that don't yet have CCA legislation, but the ones that do include Illinois, New York, and gosh, I'm sure there's a few others that are out there in the works. The enabling legislation is kind of the first step, and then you're right. Then you need communities to decide they want to take this on. Typically, what that involves is some leadership at the local government level. And CCA is pretty contagious. So if you have one community that gets interested, an elected official that wants to kind of lead the charge, or a city manager, or a sustainability staff member, which is what happened in our case, along with community-based groups. I think that the launching of MCE was really driven by our community and our advocates that wanted cleaner choices in their electricity supply. And those advocates, in concert with a passionate elected official and some staff at the local government level, that's what can really get these types of programs off the ground. And once you have one community that's doing it successfully, usually the neighboring communities want to become part of it. And that's where the Joint Powers Authority usually comes into play, with multiple communities together.
In California, anyway, how exactly does a community adopt it? Is it simply just a vote by the city council, or is there a longer process?
It is a vote by the city council, but that usually follows a very long process. Typically, there's a feasibility analysis done for the community. Any community considering CCA can request load data from their investor-owned utility. Typically, they will then analyze that data to determine what revenue they might expect. They look at what the price of energy is, and they figure out, hey, can we make it work? Will we be able to buy power at a price that allows us to serve this load and make everything pencil out? So it starts with analysis, and then there's typically a lot of community engagement, multiple meetings. The city council will often involve the public. Often they do surveys or some other way of engaging and soliciting public input before designing the program, thinking about how they might want to operate it. And then, of course, there's a phase where there's a need to engage experts on preparing the organization. But ultimately, yes, the city council needs to pass an ordinance to launch the program, and they also need to file an implementation plan with the California Public Utilities Commission. And then there are some very explicit rules that have to be followed as far as sending notices to customers months in advance of providing service, and even after providing service. So there's a lot that goes into it, which involves taking a lot of time. And in California, you actually have to file your implementation plan about 2 years before launching service. So that can add a lot of time to the process.
So it's not overnight,
No.
But it sounds like the effort's really worth it. I just want to say thank you to Dawn for joining us today. This has been tremendously informative and really wonderful to hear from you about the CCA experience and all of the various goals that MCE has and is implementing across your platform. And thank you to the audience for attending this morning. I hope you all learned something from Dawn and enjoyed the conversation. The next discussion in our Sustainable Economy Distinguished Speaker Series will be on May 19th, when I will sit down with Liz Wilmot, who is Microsoft's Carbon Program Manager, to talk about the carbon removals program that Microsoft is implementing across the world, in fact, and working on helping to reduce the amount of carbon emissions that they have put out as a company throughout their entire lifetime, and hopefully impacting the world positively. Thank you again to Dawn and to the audience. And we look forward to watching MCE do many more great things.